Um, okay, today's session, Free Will, What Does the Science Say? Free will, of course, is one of those perennial tough nut questions with philosophical issues concerning causality and so forth. But there's been an incredible amount of work done in recent decades on what happens actually in the brain and in the mind, or in the, well, I should say brain, because mind is a whole other philosophical issue. And Ray Rad is going to talk to us a little bit about that today. Ray was raised, say that 10 times fast, in Brooklyn, New York. He went to college at MIT, got a bachelor's in math, studied medicine at Columbia, did residence in psychiatry at New York Presbyterian, now is a research fellow in forensic psychiatry at Columbia, and a psychoanalytic candidate at Columbia. What a great resume. And is in private practice in New York. And I got to hear a preview of this last year. And again, this to me, the kind of work he's doing and some of the stuff that you're doing with David Kelly is really cutting edge work, thinking about some of these perennial questions. So without further ado, I'm going to let Ray Rad talk to you about free will. What does the science say? So take it away.
Thanks. So thanks, Ed, for that introduction. So I'm going to talk about free will today and try to elaborate on the objectivist view of free will using some findings from modern science. So here's my outline for today. By the way, I noticed when I was looking at my slides from the far that they may not be as clear, so if there's anything you can't see, if you can raise your hand or let me know. So my outlines, I'm first going to review the objectivist view of free will and our understanding of it. And then I'm going to review some science of self-regulation, which is a growing new scientific field in psychology, with some of the findings such as ego depletion, increasing willpower, and I'll explain what these things are as we go along. And then I'm going to return to our view of objectivism and see if we can elaborate on it based on some of these findings. So in the objectivist view, there is free will, and it is not compatible with determinism, as the compatibilists claim. So there really is such a thing as a person being able to do something of their own accord, independent of all the prior causes that came before. But specifically, it lies in the cognitive realm, and it's a type of cognitive capacity, as opposed to a type of action capacity and motor capacity in most other theories of free will. And Ayn Rand called it the power of self-initiated motion in the realm of cognition. To get a little more detailed, it is has several different powers involved. It is the power to form and manipulate abstract thoughts. So it lies at the higher level of cognition, at the conceptual level, not at perceptual levels below it. And this is one way in which the objectivist view of free will is unique. It is the freedom to control ourselves, which differs a lot from libertine views of free will, which are the freedom to do whatever you'd like. It is specifically the freedom to coordinate our actions in a very specific way towards goals and to suppress appetites and urges that get in the way of those goals. And in terms of getting into the details of what actually operates this, what's the mechanism involved, it's attention along two different variables. It's the power to increase and decrease our attention by focusing, and it's the power to shift our attention to particular topics as we go along. So Nathaniel Branden, in his lectures on objectivism, divided the focus issue into more detail and coined the term levels of awareness, where he said, at each given moment, you have the choice of raising or lowering your level of focus along a graduated ladder. From a very high state of being clear, being focused, clear, abstract, attentive to the context around any particular thing that you're thinking about or focused on, to a very low state of where thinking is vague, concrete, and inattentive to context. So anyone sitting in the audience, you could be anywhere from a range of fully paying attention to what I'm talking about, thinking about how it relates to other knowledge that you have, other things you've thought of, other lectures here, things you've heard elsewhere, things you've read, things that could be right or wrong about what I'm saying, or all the way down to asleep. But slightly above asleep, thinking is not as deliberate and not as focused. So that, and there's lots of levels in between. Although Nathaniel Branden and Ayn Rand imply that your freedom lies entirely in ability to go way up to the top here and way down at any given moment. And I'm going to get back to that later. The first thing I should mention that Ayn Rand was not the first to think of free will as lying in attention. She was preceded by William James 50 years prior, and he says he really gets at attention quite a bit in this quote, so I'll read it. Everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness are of its essence. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. So I want to highlight two things that he's bringing up here. One is that attention is about focusing on something, and it's also about withdrawing and eliminating our focus from others. And that latter, and they're related in one process. So that brings us to that the second aspect of attention here, the withdrawing from others, brings us to a new topic in psychology, which is really studying free will, although sometimes they call it that, sometimes they don't. It's a study of self-regulation, the capacity of human beings to override our impulses. And that's the ability to, and those impulses could be emotions, automatic thoughts, tendencies. Every time in your mind you override something, and there are countless examples. We are doing this from the moment you wake up. You wake up in the morning, and a part of you is telling you to stay in bed, and another part of, and you override that to get up and go to work or go to school. A part of you doesn't want to study, so you can override that and go and study. A part of you, if you override your desire for a piece of cake because you're dieting. These are all examples of self-regulation. Okay? And this is a part of what we consider free will. It's the capacity to override particular urges. And the study of this, to give you a little bit of history, started with the marshmallow experiment in the 1960s at Stanford. And what happened is they took a bunch of young children below 10 years old, and they sit, sometimes even 5 or 6, and they would seat them in a room, and one child at a time, and put a marshmallow in front of them, and an instructor would tell them, I'm going to leave the room now, and you can eat the marshmallow if you'd like, but if you can wait for me to come back and not eat the marshmallow, then I'm going to give you 2 marshmallows. So you see these kids, and they're struggling, and some of them just eat the marshmallows, some of them are like trying hard not to, but then they eat it, and some of them succeed and get 2 marshmallows when the instructor comes back. And what they basically did was, I mean, all kids like sweets. They were overriding their desire for what was in front of them. And these people were then followed, and decades later, these same people were followed, and those who had actually waited and gotten the 2 marshmallows had higher grades, higher SAT scores, were more popular, had higher salaries, had better control of their weight, and less drug abuse. It's hard to think of what else you want from your kids in the future, but it might it might correlate here. So what we're seeing here, basically, and in adults, you see the same thing. Adults, the capacity for self-regulation as an adult in an experiment correlates with better grades, less procrastination, fewer impulse control problems, better interpersonal relationships, fewer psychological problems, and more guilt and less shame, which means more ability to kind of reflect on something you've done wrong. So this is a clearly very powerful, first thing we learn is what we view as volition is a very, very powerful activity in the brain. It leads to a number of good things in a wide variety of contexts, and a number of sort of long-range benefits to ourselves. So a number of other interesting studies were found where this capacity for self-control has been studied in a number of new ways, and some very interesting findings have been found. There's a study in the late 1990s that found the phenomenon of ego depletion. And basically, what they did was take a bunch of college students and wanted to test how much can people really use this capacity? How much can people control themselves? And how does it affect their behavior in other contexts? So they took these college students and they brought them into a room where they had recently baked chocolate cookies. And there was a smell of chocolate cookies all over the room. It smelled very good. They brought them all into the room, and they put them at two ends of a table. They just brought them around the table, and they had them sit down. On one end of the table, they put a plate of these chocolate cookies that they had recently baked. And on the other end, they put radishes. And they told one half, you can eat as many of the chocolate cookies as you'd like. Well, you're going to be sitting here for about 5 minutes. Go ahead and enjoy them. And the other half, they said you can have as many radishes as you'd like, but don't touch the chocolate cookies. And it's just going to be 5 minutes. And they only had them sit there for 5 minutes. Then they took them out of the room, took them to a different room, and gave them an impossible mathematical task. They didn't know it was impossible, but it was just this sort of mathematical problem that was actually impossible to solve. And they said, try your best with this problem. Let's see how far you can get. And they included in the other room people who were not in the cookies room at all, other students as well. And it turns out that the people who were in the radish side of the table spent half as many times trying to attempt the problem and half as much time and half as many attempts on the problem. But there was no difference. Between the people who had the chocolate cookies and the people who weren't in the room at all, who weren't in the baked goods room. So what this means is there was the people who had to eat radishes only, or not eat at all. Most of them just didn't eat anything. They had to constrain their desire for the cookies, and that capacity actually decreased their ability later to do something else that also requires self-control, solving a mathematical problem rather than just kind of relaxing. So this capacity to, what we call volition, this capacity to control yourself internally is actually limited by a particular resource and can be lost over time, relatively quickly in just 5 minutes when used. So this has been found, actually repeated in a number of other studies, and it's been found pretty robust. It's a pretty robust finding. So as it was called ego depletion, meaning that there's a self-ego, and you actually, that's active, and you lose it the more you use it. So people who were asked to use self-control, either to avoid cookies or in a number of other ways, were then studied, and they were more likely to eat when they were dieting, more likely to respond to people without thinking, less likely to present themselves well to other people, more likely to underachieve intellectually, more likely to spend impulsively and have less control over their wallets, and more likely to lie and cheat in their dealings with other people. So pretty much every act of self-control in terms of, these are in terms of action, was lost over time when people have to exert self-control over some period of time. So this tells us that this act of acting volitionally is limited and can be lost, and then is lost globally across all our actions. It also impairs our ability to think rationally. So a number of other studies connected this. So far, we've just been talking about self-control in terms of action. How do you spend your money? How much time do you spend solving the math problem? But when it gets to specific analytical thinking, exerting self-control also impairs that. So people who were ego depleted by particular action self-control then had harder time and did worse on analytic problem solving in the GRE, could not do as much cognitive extrapolation from one problem to another, and did worse on reading comprehension. And you can get into, then they studied this in a little more detail. So here we have rational functioning that's lost as a result of exerting self-control. But even then they got into a little more detail in terms of what particular types of rational functioning is lost and what type is not lost. So rational function information processing is actually can be divided into two types. If you've ever seen the book Thinking Fast and Slow, that divides the same thing. There's a relatively automatic level of information processing that we're undergoing at all times. And then there's an intentional, inefficient, and costly method of deliberate reasoning that can occur on top of it. So the relatively automatic is for relatively simple functions, and the costly ones for more complicated functions. To help explain the difference, I'm gonna put a question up on the screen. The next slide is going to be a question. I want you guys to come up with an answer as quickly as you can to the question. It's just a mathematical problem. So a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. If the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Who thinks 10 cents? Okay. So that's the most common answer that occurs to almost everyone. The answer is actually 5 cents. But the first thought that occurs to almost everyone is 10 cents, and then it takes a bit of extra thinking to stop and realize that it's actually 5 cents for the ball, $1.05 for the bat, totaling $1.10. But that takes more deliberative thinking. So those are the two different kinds of thinking that are going on. There's an intuitive level and a deliberate level. And it turns out that only the deliberate level of thinking is lost by acts of self-control. The intuitive level remains the same and functions at the same rate and the same level of accuracy. So this volition is involved in only the deliberate level of thinking, but not the intuitive level of thinking. And the deliberate level of thinking is using the exact same resources in the brain as keeping yourself from eating a piece of cake or exercising other aspects of self-control. Exercising choices and making choices seems to use the exact same resource as well. One study was done where people were divided into two groups, and one group was given advertisements and a catalog and asked to just kind of flip through it and think about what they think of the advertisements and what kinds of things they might want. And another group was actually told to actually choose what they would buy with some limited amount of money that they didn't have to spend themselves, but to actually choose, not just think about which advertisements they liked. And those who actually had to make the choices rather than just enjoy the advertisements, exercised a lot more self-control and had less self-control left for other tasks. So exercising choices uses the same action. So here we can summarize some of our findings. Summarize the findings so far. What we have here, each of these sort of large boxes on the rested state side, the large box that contains an upper box and a lower box is sort of my model of the mind. And what we see is that the mind is composed of two levels of action and functioning. You have a larger, this is very commonly presented in a lot of books and slides as a rider on an elephant, if you've ever seen that. But what you have is a larger automatic functioning portion of your mind that includes automatic cognitions that come into your brain without you having to bring them up, intuitions, vague reasoning, emotions, habits of functioning, and lots of other things. And then you have a deliberate reasoning and self-control function of your mind on top of it. And when you're in a rested state, or sort of you wake up in the morning, it has a capacity to function, and it's big. And the more you use that upper part, the more it shrinks, and you get closer to the right side. And then as you exercise, so volition is your use of the upper level. It's your choice how much of it you're going to use. And the more of it you use, the more you lose it, and it becomes smaller over time. Okay? It can then be reinstated by resting, by taking a lunch break, whatever else. But you have this model where all aspects of the active self are involved in this. So you wake up in the morning, and you're from the moment you wake up toward toward the end of the day, you're actively using this upper part of your thinking to different levels of extent depending on how hard it is for you to get out of bed, how much deliberative thinking your work requires, et cetera, et cetera. And as you use that, you're losing more and more of it toward the end of the day. And toward the end of the day, you're relying a lot more on the lower functioning of your mind. And you have actually less capacity to invoke deliberative thinking even if you wanted to. So this poses an interesting hypothesis. Here we have a few different things. So volition seems to activate a global power. It is a focusing power, but it activates broadly a wide range of functions and is involved in all aspects of the active self. Here we have choice, we have deliberative thinking, we have action, self-control. There may be others, so this is just a hypothesis at this point. It fatigues very easily. And then the next obvious question, which has been studied, is can it be developed? Can willpower or our capacity to use our free will be developed? And a number of studies found that yes, it can to an extent. So here, 3 groups of students college students were again taken and divided into 3 groups. And one group was told, for the next couple of weeks, work on your posture. Whenever you're sitting down, try to sit up. Try to think about how you're standing. Another group was said, try to record everything you eat for the next couple of weeks. Don't necessarily diet or limit what you're eating, just record it and be mindful of what you're eating. And then the third group was told, strive for positive moods and emotions. To the best of your ability, try to feel happy. And the interesting thing is the first 2 are actually within your control. The last one is not. So the first 2 actually require use of your free will, of your volition to think more. And the third doesn't, but it requires it not just over the course of the day, over day after day for a couple of weeks. And then they brought these people back, and after 2 weeks, the people in groups 1 and 2 actually had more capacity to sustain their volitional state for a longer period of time than group 3. So what actually happens, they develop their capacity to focus by practicing it over a couple of weeks. Even by just performing an action. It doesn't require thinking more. So then to get into more detail, they then divided groups into 3 different kinds of activities. They said, well, how much does physical activity affect your growth of your willpower? How much does mental activity affect the growth of your willpower? So 3 different experiments were done. People were divided into, again with college students, some people were told to go to the gym daily, so to try to do physical activity, which require self-control, following a particular gym routine. Another group compared to people who did not do that. Another experiment, some people were told to study using a particular, more efficient study habits, to study at particular intervals in particular ways, compared to people who didn't. And a third group was asked to manage their money in a very deliberate way compared to people who didn't. And as it turned out, each of those 3 groups increased willpower, had increased willpower at the end of those 2 weeks. So what that says is this capacity to sustain your self-control for a longer time can be increased whether you're practicing it using action, self-controlling your actions, like going to the gym, or by thinking more, like studying more, or by managing your money more. Is sort of a global power that can be increased generally and not specifically to the thing that you're doing. As it turns out, then, each of these people also had improvements in the other 2. People who went to the gym more without noticing had better study habits and better money management skills at the end of a few weeks. People who studied more rigorously had gone to the gym more and had better money management, etc. So it's a global power. So here we have, with practice, the opposite. You can move the growth of the use of your larger, your upper function of your mind, you can make bigger over time. Okay, so getting back to objectivism, I think there's a few implications. First, I think there's a confirmation here of some of the things that have been a part of objectivism, and that Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden developed. First, free will lies in the cognitive realm. All of these acts of self-control, whether they're acts of particular action or acts of reasoning, are cognitive actions. And particular studies of how they're done show that attention is key to doing it. That it is a single function that affects our activity broadly, that exercising volition serves our self-interest, in that the more, the benefits to the self of using this, of exercising your higher functions are pretty numerous, as I listed earlier on. And that free will really does consist of the freedom to control ourselves. It's a power to constrain our actions rather than a libertine version of the power to be free from other people entirely and go with our emotions or go with our underlying power. That going with our automatic functions is not an exercise of volition. Going with our deliberative functions is. Okay, but if we go back to this levels of awareness chart, we can add a few things to it. So here we have level of focus from very focused to not so focused, and what was initially part of the model that Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden developed is that it's a matter of choice, how high up you go and how low you go at any given moment of your day. But we can add a little bit more to it based on some of these findings, that activity and time over the course of the day bring it down. So unless you're sleeping, every single thing you do that involves your active self is actually decreasing your capacity to stay up at the higher level. That really your capacity at that higher level is only early in the day or only after a period of rest or only a period of not using it for a long period of time. Okay, but we can also add that going up is not just a matter of choice either. Going up is a matter of choice in the moment to a certain extent, but over time is a matter of practice, of more activity over a longer period of time than the time factor that's on the right for going down, and a matter of effort. I guess that's also an example of choice, but in a different kind of way. So we have a choice to, in the middle, to go up and down in a moment, and another choice to grow it over time as a capacity. Nathaniel Branden anticipates this finding to some extent in his Psychology of Self-Esteem, where he says, the more consistently and conscientiously a man maintains a policy of being in full mental focus, the easier and more natural the process becomes. And the more a man maintains a policy of focusing as little as possible, the more difficult the task of thinking becomes. So he's getting a sense of the practice involved in going up and down, but he's treating it entirely as a habit, whereas some of the findings from the self-regulation literature find that it's not. It poses the question that it may not just be a habit, it may be a literal increase in capacity with increased practice in the way that our brains work biologically. And decreased capacity in the other way, obviously. So I think there's also some implications for our ethics, the objectivist ethics, not anything in terms of the fundamental principles of ethics, but some of the particular ways in which we divide moral responsibility. If we think of ethics as primarily the science of how to guide our volition and how to guide our attention, then what we know about attention being a choice in two respects leads to two different kinds of moral responsibility. At any particular time, there's a short-term moral responsibility to live today to the best of your ability and focus to the best extent that you can on each given day. But we should add a caveat to that, that you have to be mindful of this issue of ego depletion as you go along the way. So being the best you can today does not mean staying in at your highest focus state every second that you can, because then you're going to run out of it. So it's about spacing out, keeping time for relaxation, rejuvenation in the middle of your day, and knowing when you're in a state when you can fully focus and when you're not. Okay? But then there's a long-range ethical responsibility to develop your capacity to focus more by practicing it, by thinking, reading, working, exercising, remaining focused day after day, and therefore developing both a habit and an increased capacity to do more and more as you go forward in life. And I think this is a part of what makes reason of value in objectivism rather than just a virtue, that at each particular moment you're exercising it as a virtue in actually focusing, being attentive, doing what you're doing at that moment, but you're also building it as a value over time. So that's what I have. I actually finished a lot earlier than I thought.
How did they test the willpower after, in some of those experiments, how did they test the willpower afterwards? And what is the evidence for how much the ability to have willpower is innate? Like, it varies from person to person.
They tested willpower through the same studies that they tested studies similar to the initial cookie and mathematical skills test. So they would do these tests at the beginning, and then they would go home and you do these exercises, and then you come back a few weeks later and you do the same test again with a different variation, and they can see whether you've changed in your ability to concentrate the second time around. And the second part of your question was how do we know how much of this is innate or not innate? That's not a fully answered question. It would be extremely odd if it weren't partially innate. Everything is in the brain ultimately. Everyone seems to have some ability to use volition. It's probably not the same for each person. Some things that are known are that it is a reasonably robust finding is that it is powered by energy and the availability of glucose for your brain at any particular time. But that's different from what you're asking.
Yeah, so the marshmallow experiment suggests that it isn't really up to people how much of ability they have to focus or not focus, or to control themselves or not control themselves, right? I mean, these are just little kids. And then you ask parents, and they say, oh, yes, she was born independent, and he was born passive and dependent, you know. I actually had a sister, an older sister, who was sleeping in my mother's bed while poor me was in a cradle, because they said, oh, she's fine on her own, but Renu really needs me. So when I think of that, I thought, well, you know, maybe I was just lucky to be born like that. How much was up to me? It's hard to say.
So you're right that, so there's a question of an interpretation of the marshmallow experiment. It by itself as an experiment, none of anything that I've presented today proves or disproves the existence of free will. I wasn't interested in that question. Might have been better to say that earlier. I'm more interested in, we have identified, I think by direct introspection, by the deductive argument, that free will is in the area of attention, and that it does exist for other reasons. Given that it does, and given that we've identified it in objectivism as what we think it is, here are some studies on that particular function and some of its properties. And we can elaborate on our view of free will in that way. For those who don't believe in free will, this just provides some evidence of that particular function, which isn't particularly volitional. Yeah. But it correlates with what we normally think of as volitional. Yeah. But to answer your question more directly about the marshmallow experiment, it's likely the case that people do vary in their ability to distract themselves and to delay gratification, to control themselves. But it's not clear that that is entirely the reason for why the kids varied. The kids who were more successful at not eating, at waiting to get the 2 marshmallows, were those who actually distracted themselves and thought about something else, rather than those who looked at the marshmallow the whole time. Those ended up eating it. So it was a clear attentive function. It probably does vary from person to person, but we don't know that it's innate. I don't think there's any evidence to indicate that.
Okay, thanks.
My question is regarding I would guess, how things are important to us and how it can change the intuition, the automatic perception. So, as you were saying, there's the ego depletion. So my question is, can one have one's values, what is important to one, sort of become intuition and make that correct decision, and then little by little keep doing that, change our character, have it become automatic so it's not a battle all the time to repress the marshmallows or whatever? And in particularly, I'd like to ask within the context of some of the things that are seen that define humans almost. For example, a lot of people are subject to the halo effect, where we think more beautiful people have better qualities. After a couple of bad relationships with really beautiful people, that tends to go wrong one way or the other. But either this person reminds me of that person, and it's like you have a complete aversion to it almost automatically. So that's that context. And if you can do that, is there a way, is there more or less something we can do to train that?
So that's a very good question. I'm going to clarify the question by going back a little bit. What you're asking is, in this diagram on the left, if the use of our deliberative reasoning and self-regulation capacity can influence our automatic thoughts and intuition and move them over time more in line with what we'd like them to be, and then be able to use our deliberative reasoning for other things over time. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that. That's another aspect of this. I was focusing entirely on the use of that higher capacity and its growth and shrinkage. But yes, the answer is yes. And there's a lot of evidence from cognitive psychology and the psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy specifically, that shows that if you recognize what's coming from your intuitions and everything else that's coming at us all the time, and isolate them and deliberately think otherwise in repeated situations, you change them. So over time, you're not just constantly overcoming the same underlying emotions and intuitive thoughts all the time. You can change them, and then but then you only have a limited capacity to change them at any particular time, right? And as they change, you still have that limited capacity. It frees you up to then use it for something else, and to change things further in the direction that you want. But what I was emphasizing here is just that limited capacity. Okay. But the answer is yes.
I think my question refers to the distinction between the objectivist view of free will and the, I guess, libertarian view of free will. Would you say that our ability to use volitional thinking is actually not volitional in and of itself? If we have this set capacity and this ego depletion, is our ability to continue making ourselves do things actually an involuntary function of our mind, sort of like a muscle that can be stretched, but not something that we have complete control over, except in a long-term sense?
Two things. One, I didn't mean to say libertarian view of free will. I think libertarians differ in terms of their views. But yeah, libertine specifically, this statement out there in literature that freedom is a freedom to sit back and not have to think. But is this possibly not an issue of volition at all? And is this possibly just a muscle that you have that exercises itself or does not exercise itself according to these patterns, where it exercises itself in the morning and loses its capacity over the course of the day? I think there's nothing in the evidence here that suggests, in specifically the data that I'm presenting, that suggests otherwise. But I think you have to twist yourself into a pretzel to actually believe that about human beings, including in yourself and other people in life. It's kind of, I'm going on the premise that, when you're waking up in the morning and you're kind of tired, but you get yourself up and you get out of bed, you're doing that, and then I'm taking that capacity and looking at what studies say about that. But I think it's independent of whatever studies I'm presenting, whether you believe that that's volitional or not.
Thank you.
Hello. That was fascinating and useful, so thank you. I have a question about those studies that were done, the 2-week studies with students. One of them was where they recorded what they ate every day, and that was one of the 2 that you said showed that they had increased ability. But that third one, the one where they were supposed to be happy and try to be as optimistic as possible, was the only one in those studies that didn't turn out to increase the ego depletion, or increase the ability to focus. And I was wondering about that because you didn't explain it, but also I was thinking, is it because, possibly because it's such a diffuse task and takes up more of your mental capacity to think about something that's non-specific?
There are other studies that elaborate on that a little bit more, but basically directly altering your mood is not within anyone's capacity. You cannot, if you're feeling sad, just say, I'm going to feel happy. What you're actually doing, if you ever succeed at that, is changing your thought first, and your emotions are following. And that's been found. And you're distracting your attention away from the reason why you're feeling sad. But directly striving to but then emotions change over the course of the day based on new information and new things that happen to you. So directly striving for changes in your emotions, directly, as opposed to changes in your thought, is an ineffective task that doesn't use those. It's one, ineffective. It's been found to be ineffective. But 2, it doesn't use the self-control and deliberative reasoning powers. It just says, try to feel better. The self-control reasoning powers specifically apply to areas where you're trying to do something or think something that isn't automatic to you. And that's why it didn't work.
So the practicing is what didn't work.
They were practicing something that didn't use that same capacity that they were trying to build.
Okay, thank you.
If that makes sense, yeah.
The free will debate is typically centered on whether we have the ability to, actually freely will things. And it seems, what I really liked about your research is that it seems to show that what people are actually doing is equivocating ability with difficulty. It seems pretty clear that we have the ability of free will, but that what people are pointing to when they say, oh, we don't have free will, is that the difficulties range. And I think that kind of points to what Neera was getting at, and that some children have a greater amount of difficulty. And I think that supports kind of what you're getting at. So there's almost like a drag coefficient to utilizing your will. But the will ability is there. Now, if that, A, does that make sense? And B, in your research, do you think that the ego depletion, which I imagine is really just a placeholder for the science of what we'll figure out later to be something extremely ridiculously complex in the cognitive realm, because ego depletion, that's okay. We can study it, but we have no idea what it is, right? Do you think it's something, because it sounds like we're either losing something that facilitates, if we assume we have the ability, and that's a given, it seems like we're either losing something which allows us to freely engage the will, or there's an increase of something which hinders our ability to focus our attention. So that's part 2. I think I might have thrown a lot at you. But A, does that seem right, that there is some sort of, that it's more of a matter of difficulty? And B, do you, in your research, just sort of like a personal reflection, think it's going to be an issue of losing something or something being added to the process?
So the first part of that is free will, does everyone have the same volition, and is it just a difference in use of it? Or there's a number of things, I think, that affect the differences among people in terms of their exercise of deliberative capacity and self-regulation. You're right that the majority of the debate is whether we have free will or not. But I think one aspect of it is, yes, there is an ability that not everyone knows how to use, because learning how to use it is learning how to use our cognitive apparatus, and it's like doing some of the things that these studies showed. Trying to strive for better moods doesn't work. Thinking in particular ways does. Going to the gym does, even though striving for better, it's not obvious to people how to use that capacity in the right way. But there also could be more than that. There really might be a limitation on the ability without practice and development. We don't know. So this is part of what I was getting at here with this slide. Each person has some ability to go up and down in terms of their focus at each particular time point, but they also have the ability to build more of it over time. So if you want to take, an example might be, if someone's been an alcoholic for a long time, been at home not working and supported by other people, they really may not have the ability to focus enough to go to work the next day and start a brand new life. The argument, presented often by the left rather than us, that there really is that lack of ability to turn life around all at once, really might be true. It might be, though, but that doesn't mean that they don't have that long-term ability to build it step by step by not drinking one day at a time, after a while taking a part-time job, building up from there. So I think there's some truth to the argument that there may be some truth to the argument that some people don't have a full ability of free will as others because of where they are. Was that only the first part of your question?
Yeah.
Remind me what the second half was.
Second part was, is that, well, I sort of depended on you agreeing with me.
What biologically accounts for the differences for this issue of ego depletion? That's broadly what you're at. Physiologically, I don't know, but it's not necessarily the case that it's going to be some proxy for some other actual phenomenon. There's a few phenomena in the brain that are not, this is really wild hypothesizing here, but the brain requires energy. Glucose is transported to the brain, it requires oxygen. These things dissipate as you use them. The brain is also run by neurons that fire and use up their chemicals as they're firing and have to regenerate for the next time. There are functionings at the neuron level and at the energy level that could be, over time, plausible explanations for this.
There's a saying among pilots that there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. In loosely taking liberty with the term egoist, are you suggesting there are old egoists and there are bold egoists, but there are no old, bold egoists with the depletion? Number one. Number two, comment on the concept of observance. Often, especially with children, we hear, well, they're very observant of their environment, therefore they can react to it. How does that factor into your discussion? Some people seem to be more observant, therefore can focus and do more. Some people observe only inside, and they're so concerned with inside that they have a difficult time reacting to the,
So the old and either old or bold, but not both argument, I don't think that applies here. What you have in, I'm not a pilot, but what you have in activities like that is you have other deteriorations as you get older of other biological functions, eyesight, even other functions in your brain. Things like anger and courage are decreased over time as people get older for not fully known reasons right now. But this is not necessarily the case. The more this dissipates over the course of the day, but does not dissipate the more you use it over long periods of time. It actually increases the more you use it over long periods of time. So there's no evidence here to suggest that kind of factor. The other issue is observance. Without studying that issue, the one possible hypothesis is attention. If we think of attention as a limited resource, and the directed use of attention, then in your particular example, attention can be pointed either inward or outward. And there are other variables over which attention can vary. But people who, there may be different capacities for the overall exertion of attention. There may also be people who divide it differently, where focusing inwards decreases the amount that you have available to go outwards and vice versa. But that's only hypothesis.
Okay, so I had a question about this last slide because
this one?
Yeah, the one you have right here. So you said you basically said that it's ethical to learn to train yourself to focus, and that's what makes reason of value as compared to a virtue. And I was just hoping you could explain that a little more.
Okay.
Yeah.
That particular point. So in objectivism, reason is, this was always a complicated thing for me to wrap my mind around, but reason is both a value and a virtue. And in objectivism, values are things that are the direct objects of your actions, and virtues are the things you practice to get to those objects. And reason is a value and rationality is a virtue, and I just thought it was in two different places. It was, it's enough to be rationality for me. Why is reason also a value that we achieve for its own, as an end, rather than just the means for these other values? And I think, right, well, life is the ultimate value, but the proximal ones, reason, purpose, self-esteem. So I think a part of the reason for that, for reason being not just something you practice as rationality, but as a goal, is that it's something that needs to be cultivated in this particular way and brought up as an object of your rationality and of your productiveness and everything that you do to cultivate it over time.
Are you saying that all emotions, say disgust, love, even other things like physical attraction, whatnot, arise from a process that we do not have direct control of at the time, and therefore is pointless to try and change it at the time? And Nathaniel, in one of his books, talks about, I believe it was one of his wives, who was one of the most consistently happy people he had ever been with. And she had the process of, before going to sleep at night every time, going over the good things in her life. Later on, he says that he picked up that practice and that he noticed that he himself found a propensity to be more happy throughout the day. If you have any opinions on that, but the first one is essentially is that all our emotions, I just want to get it clear. What you were saying is directly changing them is just not happening.
I wasn't saying that. I'm saying that I'm taking an adult human being who has formed patterns of emotions in particular circumstances that are not sort of unexplained or unexplainable, but at that moment they are what they are. Today I am who I am, and I'm saying at that moment you have a limited capacity to overcome your emotional tendencies if you want to. And that doesn't mean that over time they cannot be overcome completely by repeated efforts of gradually overcoming them day by day. But at each particular moment, that capacity is limited. And that doesn't mean those emotions are unexplained by prior cognitive processes and prior assumptions and all these other things. An important principle in objectivism is that emotions, the application of a particular emotion to a particular situation is not inborn, it's created by a result of your particular cognitive beliefs. I'm not challenging that, nor am I supporting it with this evidence, but that's perfectly consistent with everything that's said here, if that makes sense. I don't think I have an answer to the latter part.
Okay.
Okay.
Then I'll ask a hard question that'll take 3 minutes. It's kind of a tangent. The so-called flow experiences, do they relate to this model at all? They're kind of a paradox because they seem, on the ego and sort of the underneath automatic function model, they seem to involve both at once. I wondered, are they experienced as ego depleting or building, or are they something else completely?
Okay, so I see what you're saying. What he's saying is this seems to posit that a conflict between the upper level that I have in the diagram here and the lower level one. And he's saying there are other experiences in life. Flow is a very well elaborated one about where driving is a good example. If you're a good driver, in the moment when you're driving and there aren't too many distractions, you're just fully engaged in it. Your emotions, intentions, automatic thoughts, and your deliberative abilities are more or less in harmony, and there isn't this. So that would be another example of a use of your attention. How do they fit with this? This is a different example. Self-regulation is one particular example of the use of attention, and I'm using it because it's an elaborated system of study to draw some general guidelines about general observations about free will. It is likely the case that ego is depleted in flow as well, but it's just a different use of attention. They don't contradict each other in any way. I don't think this capacity for ego depletion is only in the case of self-regulation. It's for any, as far as we know, for any higher level cognitive processes. And it's actually independent. One of the things that may confuse people is that in flow, here, this kind of capacity is difficult. You're like, do I want that piece of cake, or I don't want it, or whatever is your activity, do I want to get out of bed? Because of the conflict between your deliberative capacity and your underlying intuitions. But in flow, it's an easier process to experience because they're in harmony. But the difference in effort does not affect this ego depletion. They're still both depleted at a similar rate.
Thank you.